Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Peace and Justice Center. Today we are going to talk about television and why it's bad. I'm just kidding. But we are going to talk about it from like a critical lens, mostly talking about like its impacts on social relationships and social structures in the United States over the last like 70 years or so. To give a little bit of background, let's talk about when television was developed and when it became like a big force in American life. Television is not an outgrowth of film or cinema. It's actually an outgrowth of radio, which surprised me when doing preliminary research on this. I was thinking, oh, people go to film houses and they're going to think, well, I want the film to be in my house instead of having to go to the theater. But that's not actually what happened. What happened was people were constantly trying to figure out a way to transmit images via radio waves rather than just transmitting sound. So in the late 19th century, there were really like remedial forms of this. Mostly like it wasn't even using primarily electricity. It was using like rotating discs that would like take snapshots of an image. I don't even know how it works. To be honest, like I am a social historian, not a scientist. So when I explain this, don't quote me on this. But it wasn't using an electronic medium. It was using like analog rotating discs in order to like print out an image somewhere else. And that was the first form of like, okay, we're going to be here filming something, and then somewhere else it's going to like and then print out what we said, what we're filming. But it was like using radio waves. But it was like it could only take like a still image. It was basically transmitting like a really poorly drawn photograph. Was what was going on. And then in the 1920s, there was an American by the name of Philo Farnsworth, who lived in Idaho, who came up with a way to do it entirely electronically. He was a Mormon guy, which is like interesting to me because I grew up in Utah and know a lot of Mormons. So I was like, oh, okay, Mormons invented television. So he came up with, basically what it's called is he was drawing off of technology that was developed in Europe that's called like a CRT cathode ray television. Cathode ray television, which is why televisions used to be like, they had like a big screen and then it would kind of like shrink back because that was the way that the thing was shaped. And then that became a much more, hi, come on in. That became like a much more affordable medium. And like much more practical. You could actually transmit moving images through radio waves. So that was in the 1920s. Development of the television was kind of like, a lot of people thought that television was, this always happens with new technology. It wasn't really commercially viable because radio had just barely become like really, really big in the 1930s. So people were like, well, why would people want an image when they've got sound? Like, this is great, you know, like one of the arguments people used was like, well, people don't want to sit there and watch an image all day. Like, they want to be doing something. So like sound is good enough. So all you podcasters are probably like, yeah, that's right. So television kind of slowed its development in the 1930s, and then World War II happened, which was another big, obviously, global event that slowed this. And then at the end of World War II, they came up with a really cheap way to actually do this. And so then starting in 1948, you started to have like mass market affordable television sets. 1948 was, so television had the fastest saturation of any like technological innovation of the 20th century, in the sense that like it was the fastest to reach 75% or more of American households. So radio took 12 years, I think, from when it was at 1% of American households to 75% of American households. Telephone took like 64 years from when 1% of people had it to 75% of people had it. Television took 7 years. So from 1948 was when 1% of Americans had it. By 1955, 75% of Americans had it. And at this point, you know, greater than 99% of households have a television in their house. So what does this mean, right? Like, what has this done to us as people to like have this like widely available kind of unavoidable source of technology? a lot of people think not so good things. The first book I want to discuss is this book called Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. And he has become quite prominent in explaining sort of America's loneliness epidemic. He recently came out with a book called, and it's a documentary too, called Join or Die, where he's like, you need to join a club or else Americans' cultural life is going to wither. But this book came out in 2001, and he's basically charting the loss of America's social fabric. Like, he's looking like people are going to church less, people are going to clubs less, people are hanging out with their friends less. Like, all these things are happening, and he's trying to explain why that happened. Because if you looked at like sort of statistics of civic engagement in the 1960s and 70s was really, really high. So it was a really quick decline. Like, you had like, maybe 20 years, and then all of a sudden nobody's going to clubs anymore, and no one's hanging out with their friends anymore. And he has a couple like arguments for why this happened. One of the biggest ones is he talks about car culture and like, we've built out suburban sprawl, so people are less likely to go to city centers. But the biggest one he says is it's probably television. If you look at the chart on the first page of the handout I gave you, you'll notice that like 80% of Americans in this chart, and this is from Bowling Alone, are watching television is their primary activity in the evening every night. So this is from the year 2000, to be clear. So obviously this chart would look quite different today, but they're doing that more often than they're talking to their family. 30% more often than they're talking to their family, which I find quite shocking. They're doing it more than reading the mail. They're doing it more than reading the news. So throughout the chapter in Bowling Alone, where he talks about television, Robert also talks about like every type of social engagement you're less likely to be doing if you primarily watch television as a form of entertainment. Like people who list television as their primary form of entertainment are much less likely to have gone to a club meeting that month. They're much less likely to have written a letter to a friend that month. They're much less likely to have gone to church that month. Like, all these things are shaped by people's preference for staying home and watching television. And just the level of market saturation, right? Everyone has a television, so it's right there. It allows people to be entertained without going outside or doing anything. So Robert makes like the bold case that television is probably the prime, like he calls it the ringleader in this like circus of why Americans have become more lonely. Robert has updated his thesis quite a bit over the last 25 years to include social media, but he actually doesn't view social media as too different from television. He's like, we're doing the same things. We're staring at a screen for hours at a time rather than getting outside and engaging with our friends, which we can actually which I would like to talk about more as we go throughout these like theories, because I think that is there's a reason why that might be. So we know now that, okay, so television became this like widely used technology. It isolated a lot of people. It like killed the civic engagement momentum that had peaked in the 1960s to the point where now people are usually spending time watching television at the turn of the 20th century rather than getting outside and engaging with people. So we had a couple theorists in the 70s and 80s who were trying to explain, well, why is that? Like, why are people so hooked on television? Like, what is it doing to people's brains, or what is it doing to people that would because it doesn't seem logical that people would rather sit at home than go outside and see people. So one of the most prominent ones of these books is Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman, which came out in 1985. Neil is very clearly trying to write a book in response to the re-election of Ronald Reagan, which he finds entirely to blame on what he calls the age of show business. He thinks that Ronald Reagan was elected because he was a famous actor, and that more or less explains it, which I think is probably a little simplistic, but he does think that is a huge motivating factor that he thought was talked about less than it should be. But Neil's argument is that America used to be what he called a typographic society, which is a society that is primarily getting all of their information from the printed word. And America was far more literate than most countries throughout like its early history. Neil's talking about like, if you look at literacy rates in New England in like the 1700s and 1800s, America was far more literate than like any comparable country. So clearly people valued reading. They wanted to read more. That was how they got most of their information. We had like a very newspaper-heavy, reading-heavy, library-heavy society. And Neil kind of, I would say, glorifies this era as like the era in which people were very like smart and understanding about the world, which I don't know that that's actually accurate. But given all the social problems that still existed in the 19th century, but he is saying that like people were able to contextualize a lot of information, quite complex information, in ways that we are no longer able to because of television. One of his biggest examples is he uses the Lincoln-Douglas debates, which were the big senatorial debates between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas in Illinois in like the 1850s, that would go on for a long time. These are like two men debating for hours and hours, and they were quite complex debates. They were using like quite highfalutin language, you could say. They were referring to specific events, they were referring to specific policy proposals, and they would go, but they were really, really well attended. Like you had like hundreds and hundreds of people going out to watch Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas debate for like 6 hours, which is wild. So Neil's like, that type of society in which everyone wants to like sit there and like chew on like policy debates for hours at a time couldn't possibly exist in what he calls the age of show business, because now we need like really short, quippy policy statements, and debates should only go on for like at most 45 minutes, and we just need everybody to so he thinks that there's a reason why that happened. So he's sort of through the second half of the book explaining what television is doing to people's like capacity to like process information. So one of the things he says is that we exist in he says that television invented this thing called the now this problem, which is, for most of human history, when you were having an event described to you, to have another event described to you, it had to like be contextualized in some way. You wouldn't just go, this happened and then this happened. It would have to be like, this happened for this and this reason, which led to this, or this is related to this other thing that's happening. And he's like, if you're watching a television news broadcast, it's saying this thing happened in Syria. Oh, and then this thing happened in Georgia. And it's like, there's no relationship between those two things at all. So you're not getting very much context. You're not getting very much information, really. You're just getting like little bits of a headline, which he says is rewiring our brains to accept that level of information rather than getting anything more in depth. Which he then goes on to argue allows us to accept lies from politicians way more readily than we used to. Because he's like, what is a lie except for a statement removed from context? He's like, an example would be someone, you could have a video clip of someone saying, I prefer apples to oranges. And then you could have another clip of that person saying, I prefer oranges to apples. But contextually, those could both be true statements. Because what if they prefer apples to oranges when it comes to like, a certain type of dessert, but they prefer oranges to apples when it comes to juice? If removed from the context of those statements, they could both be true, but you could clip those two and say, hey, look, this person is lying. Which Neil's saying that level of like ability to remove information from a context leads people to distrust that anyone's telling the truth, even when someone's telling you that someone's lying, which I think is pretty prescient to we certainly have politicians right now who will say one thing one day and a completely different thing the next day, and you will have people who say, well, he's not lying because removed from context, maybe he believes this thing one day and he believes this other thing the next day. Like there's never any sort of accountability given because our brain is being rewired to accept these kinds of statements. That's at least Neil's argument. And so Neil, he sort of says that, he also says that television is limited in its ability to convey information. By the medium itself, it can't give you as much information as reading a book would give you, or reading the newspaper would give you. So his solution sort of to this problem is, he's like, I think that what people need to be doing is they need to be aware of the limitations of television when they're watching it, so that they know that like whatever they're reading, whatever they're watching from television news is limited. And if they want to actually get more information about it, they should read a book, or they should go read the newspaper or something like that. And there is some, like, I guess, harder scientific evidence that he's correct about the limitations of television as a news medium. If you look at your pamphlet if you look at your paper, the handout, on the back of it, the very last thing I added was a study done by Farley Dickinson University that like basically studied people's media consumption habits and then asked them how much did they know about like current events. And if you watched Fox News, you were 18% less likely to know what's going on in the world than someone who didn't watch the news at all. So someone who like didn't consume the news in any capacity. So it's clear that like, and that they controlled for partisanship, they controlled for all these different things. So it's not just like, oh, the people most likely to watch Fox News are less likely to know the thing. It's like, no, there's something literally about watching Fox News that makes you less informed about what's going on. But like, don't be too happy if you're like an MSNBC viewer, because the same thing is true of MSNBC. It's like slightly less pronounced. I think it's like 10% less likely to know about an event than somebody who watches no news at all, but you're still less likely to know about global events than someone who just didn't watch the news in any capacity. And it's not true of every television program. This is probably going to make some people feel really excited, but the most informed television viewer would be somebody who watches The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, according to that study. The person who watches The Daily Show is about 2% more likely to know what's going on in the world than somebody who doesn't watch the news. And then the highest performing sort of mediums were by far print newspaper and listening to NPR. So you weren't watching the news, you were either listening to it or reading it. Those were the two most, like, I think somebody who listens to NPR it's like the exact inverse of Fox News. It's like you're 18% more likely to know what's going on in the world than somebody who watched the news. And I think reading the news was like you're 10 points more likely to know what's going on in the world than someone who watched it, or who didn't watch the news or consume any news at all. So there is something inherent to the medium of television that is preventing information from being processed in the same way that it would if you were to get it somewhere else, which is really interesting. And Neil has some arguments about why that might be. He's like, news shows are often portrayed as it's like an it's meant to entertain you more than it's meant to actually inform you. They're not trying to give you context for any of these events. They're trying to be like, whoa, this is shocking. Like, let's pan the camera and go to this thing, and whoa, that's scary. And then, so like there's no, I think Fox News is particularly prominent at doing this. I think that's why they probably perform the worst, is because it's like, have you heard about this shocking thing? Oh my gosh, you'd be so upset. Like they're just doing that all the time, which I think is just not conducive to understanding. So Neil doesn't, he's not saying that we should get rid of television, but he is saying that like the best uses for television, ironically, he says that the best uses of television is like garbage programming. He's like, if you want to watch TV, you should watch like soap operas or something, because that's at least not pretending to tell you the truth about the world. It's just telling you, like, you're just sitting there watching nonsense. And so he says that if you want to get serious information, television is just not the medium to do it. But he doesn't outright call for getting rid of television. But there was somebody who did do that. Actually published prior to Neil Postman. So Neil Postman actually mentions gerrymander in the book and says, like, that guy's a little bit of a crank because he thinks we could just get rid of it. But published in, I think, 1978, the book 4 Arguments for the Elimination of Television by Gerrymander does outright call for the medium to be abolished. It doesn't. He thinks that it's completely irredeemable. There's nothing useful about it, and the argument he uses is that there are some technologies that are developed, and I think that this is actually quite. It's a profound argument. He's saying that there are some technologies that are developed that are meant to be used in a particular way. Like you don't tools are not neutral. If you invent the nuclear weapon, you're intending the nuclear weapon to be used in a particular way. It's not like, well, it depends on who's using it or if it's good guys or bad guys. It's like, no, the technology itself is the message, or the medium is the message, is another way to say it. So he's saying that television is itself not conducive to anything positive just in and of itself. He thinks that the medium was developed he thinks it was developed for the proliferation of advertising, and there's no other way to do it. I think there's a quote on the sheet where he basically says that the advertising is the message. The show is just to get you to keep watching. So the whole reason that television exists is to proliferate advertising, which Gerrymander worked in the advertising industry. So that's part of why he wrote this book. He thought that the advertising industry was really corrupt and was causing people to buy things. I mean, he says in the book, he's like, advertising only exists to sell you things you don't need, because if you needed them, then you would buy them. Like you would figure out. So advertising is just there to try and convince you need something that you don't. And he thinks that television as it exists is like the most efficient advertising manipulation platform ever devised. I do think that he is bringing up a really, really good point about advertising as the method for profit seeking on television, because he's saying that the motive of the person producing the program is not it's not even really for you to be entertained. It's for you to keep watching. That's really the only thing that they care about, because they want to make sure that you see the ads. So that's why, you can tie this back to some of the stuff that Neil Postman was saying and being like, well, so Fox News doesn't care if you're informed. Like this, or MSNBC doesn't care if you're informed. The survey that shows that people are less informed doesn't matter to them, because all they care about, I mean, it also says in the survey that Fox News and MSNBC are far more watched than many other cable news shows. Like The Daily Show, even though it gave you the most information, is less watched than either MSNBC, CNN, or Fox News. So that's really all they care about, because they just want you to watch, because they just want you to see the advertisements. And I think that is really, really prescient at understanding kind of the way that social media works, because it's really the exact same incentive. So that's why, I think that Gerrymander, while I'm sympathetic to the arguments that he's kind of a little bit of a crank, because I think that we can't just get rid of television entirely, although maybe you can try. But he is, I think, pointing out the incentive of the medium is probably not conducive to what you're using it for. And I think that is why you can have, we behave so similarly with Facebook and Instagram and TikTok as we did with television. We're sitting there watching it as much as possible because the advertisers want us to. That's the incentive. Yeah, I think that and his other arguments, Gerrymander kind of goes off the rails a little bit. He talks about because for the most part, these people are talking about television news, right? They're talking about the if you're trying to be informed by watching TV, you're not getting the thing that you think you're getting. You're instead, just getting enraged or you're hearing what you want to hear, whatever it is that keeps you glued to the screen. But that doesn't really talk about other forms of television, right? Arguments for the elimination of television, it's more like it's for arguments for the elimination of television news, which I think is much more solid. And if the book had been called that, I'd probably agree with it. But I think that television itself, you can argue that there are certain programs that give you the wrong idea about the world. Robert Putnam, in addition to television news, mentions, which is the quote on the sheet, he talks about true crime television shows, like Dateline or 60 Minutes would have been what he's referring to as like giving you a wrong-headed idea of how much crime is in the world. Like people have like a completely skewed view of how dangerous like a city would be because they've seen so much crime shows that they're like, oh, I can't go into Midtown Manhattan without getting mugged or something. But it's like the likelihood of you being mugged in Midtown Manhattan is far less likely than most people think. And you can look at statistical charts of people always thinking that the crime rate is rising, even though the crime rate has actually fallen quite a lot since the 1980s. We live in a much, much safer society now than we did in the 1980s, just in terms of crime rate. But nobody thinks that. Everyone thinks that the crime rate is always going up. And a lot of these people are saying that that's because of like the proliferation of crime shows and things like that. So you could argue that like there are certain narrative tools that the television is using that is also, harmful. And again, advertising, they're just trying to get you to keep watching. So of course the crime shows are going to try and be as shocking or provocative as possible. But I do think, the counter arguments to what they're saying, I think, can be pretty good in certain instances. Like, I think the one of the biggest counter arguments, kind of a sort of historical argument, is that the Vietnam War ended because it was broadcast on television. Like people who are reading about atrocities don't feel it as viscerally as someone who's seeing something happen. I think you could make the same argument for like a lot of the protesters now who are seeing what's going on in Gaza. If they were just getting it from print, they probably wouldn't be as viscerally upset and as motivated to get out there and try and stop what's going on. So that's one prominent counter argument to this. Is like, well, maybe visual medium isn't as good at giving you context. It's not as good at letting you process information, but it is good at like giving you a gut reaction to something that doesn't need to be stopped. I think that another prominent counter argument, and I think this might be the best one because I actually haven't heard like a solid refutation. I think the argument that we need television to give people like sort of the visceral reaction. I think you could argue that like, well, you could write viscerally enough that people could kind of get that same reaction. But the other argument I've heard is that connecting people to people different than themselves through access to mass media is really, really important to people who live in like inherently isolated areas. Like Robert Putnam is saying, it's a tragedy that people are sitting at home watching television all day rather than getting outside and getting engaged in their community and going to clubs and things like that. But what if your community kind of sucks? Like what if you are somebody who is queer or trans or LGBTQ and you live in like rural Utah, where no one is supportive because of like a very stifling religious culture or something like that. And there's no way that you would ever know what it even means to be queer or trans unless you had access to people living that. What is that?
It's a wood brush, sorry.
Oh, no, you're good. Unless you had access to that, like, you could see someone succeeding while being openly queer, and the way to do that would be through some form of mass media, right? Like people often say that Will and Grace is the reason why gay marriage became so acceptable, is because a lot of people watched that show. But I think that shows like that have also been a boon to people who are struggling, like people who are in I remember being young and living in Utah and watching Will and Grace and being like, oh, like that's what a gay person is like, like that's and I would have never known that because it was so filled with fear about what that means. So I think that is a really, really good argument that like sometimes forms of mass media can be really good and really beneficial to people. Does that really refute the argument that advertising is the way to do that? I don't think so. So like, I think that the main argument you can kind of synthesize from all these people, at least to me, is that, people who are relying on advertising revenue for their source of income are not motivated to tell you the truth. Like that's not the motivation. The motivation is to keep you watching in whatever way possible. So why are we talking about? Why did I decide to do a talk on television? I think that we all know that whether or not you like him or dislike him, our current president is a reality television star, right? That is where he got his fame. That's where he comes from. And I think that and a good, like, I don't know, half the cabinet is also got their fame from like conservative television news or something like that, which I think is quite troubling, just because that is a weird transition. And I think that it's important that we like sort of maybe do like a short deep dive into how that might have happened using kind of these arguments that people are talking about here. So Donald Trump was born in 1946, which is the same year that the first boxing match was on television from Yankee Stadium. About 140,000 people watch it. It's still less than 1% of people had a television in their home, but it was like, he was born on the same day as like a large television event first happened, which is really appropriate. And then he was, during his formative years, the television grew quite, just exponentially. If you read his book Art of the Deal, one of the very first memories he can remember is his mother being enthralled by like the glitz and glamour of the coronation of Elizabeth I, or Elizabeth II, not Elizabeth I. That'd be crazy. Elizabeth II, which was for the first time the coronation was being broadcast, and he talks about how his mother was like just enthralled by this, and he was enthralled by the fact that his mother was enthralled by the television. So Donald Trump like sort of rose to public consciousness as a television character. If you look at his first TV appearances in 1980, he was on the Today Show. This is when he's like 33. And he's clearly trying to bill himself as like the symbol of wealth and success. That's what he wants people to think of when they think of him. Tom Brokaw is interviewing him, and he's like, why do you put your name so prominently on things? Like what, he's like, well, cause I want, I can't do Trump. He says that he wants the Trump name to be associated with success. So to like build these like sort of glitzy buildings and things like that, and then put his name on them is to like symbolize that Trump means powerful or wealthy or successful. And I think that it worked. I think for a long, long time, that was the character he played on television, and that was what people expected of him, of all different political parties, right? You had, he makes a cameo in the movie Home Alone 2 as just like the owner of the hotel that the guy's in, oh, this is what a joy to see like this big, powerful, rich guy. And then like throughout the 1990s and the 2000s, that was the character he would just constantly play. Like anytime they needed a stand-in for somebody who means wealth and success, they just hire Donald Trump to come in and do something. Then you had The Apprentice, in which that was the whole reason The Apprentice became a show, was because that was what he was like. The premise of the show was like, isn't this guy wealthy and successful, and he can fire people and whatever. So I think that a lot of these books are talking about how the images that people portray on television become more important than the actual reality. If Donald Trump keeps portraying this image of being a really successful businessman, then that's what people are going to think. Even if, the truth is that he bankrupted a casino in Jersey and he's never been the most powerful real estate developer in New York, but like that's the image that people have associated, and it's really, really difficult to get that image out of people's minds. Which is why, to this day, if you interview people and ask who, when pollsters are asking people who would do better with the economy, who would do better with business, Donald Trump has won all those polls. Even when he lost the election in 2020, he was still thought of as the guy who would be better for business, because that's the image that people are so prominently associate with him. And I think that a lot of these books are arguing fundamentally that like we're living in a society in which people value image over substance, and that's what television has allowed us to do. So yeah, I think that the what exactly do we do about that? That's a really hard question, but luckily we're not the first people to like think about that. There was a protest movement called the Situationist International that saw this coming really early, in the 1950s and 1960s, predominantly in France, but like throughout Europe. That sort of developed this theory that what we're creating is something they called the Society of the Spectacle, in which image is replacing substance. Like the first line in the book, The Society of the Spectacle, is societies in which the conditions of modern production prevail have made themselves a mass collection of images where like that which was directly lived has been replaced with representation. Like Donald Trump doesn't have to be the most rich person alive. He just has to represent himself that way. And that becomes the truth to a lot of people. And I think that the Society of the Spectacle and what the Situationists were saying was like really, really profound and really prescient in like figuring out, because they're not just talking about television. They're talking about like the ways in which image is replacing actual life, like which I think is a lot of these books you could transfer a little bit onto social media, but that's directly transferable. You know, like it becomes more important to appear, you know, like you're having a good time on Instagram than you're actually having a good time, because what you really want is likes and comments and things like that. Or yeah. So luckily, I'm gonna steal a thing from TV here. Next month. Oh yeah. Oh, we're gonna do Q&As right after this. Yeah.
Actually, can you slide all 4 of those books 3 inches to the left? Yes. There you go.
Yeah. So next month, our next history lecture is going to be all about the Situationists. So if you want to know what people have done about this like sort of somewhat dystopian situation in which we live, come out on April 19th and we'll talk all about the Situationists and what they did. And that's what do they call that? It's like a tune in next week, but tune in next month. So yeah, I know that this was like a bit, this talk was like maybe a bit darker than what our usual rad history lectures are about. Usually I'm talking about like, these are activists who did really cool things and you can do cool things. And this is more like, this is kind of a crappy situation we all find ourselves in. And here's some theorists who talk about it. But next month, we're going to talk about what we can do about it and what other people have done about it in the past. Woo! But now, does anyone have it? Like, I would love to hear some pushback. Let's get some questions and Q&A. Yeah. You can go first, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so, I mean, to clarify, by social media, do you mean, like, encompassing all of social media, or, like, that algorithm feed, like, threads, or just, like, also the kind of, like, the more interpersonal connection that you get between, like, talking to another person, like, via screens and tablets and stuff?
Yeah, I think I would say that like, the history of social media kind of followed the same trajectory as the history of sort of electronic media, from radio to television, in the sense that like we've gone from mostly, well, I mean, it even follows the trajectory from a typographic society to a show business society, because we've gone from like, you know, social media primarily being text posts and people text to now it's TikTok, which is like, you know, almost directly analogous to television, in which it's just a constant stream of content. But I do think that, like, yes, I think that social media itself could be something different. Like, I think that the like Facebook and Instagram and these things are advertisement revenue based, right? The whole reason that they exist is because, well, and it's even a more insidious form of that, because television is selling advertisements based on the idea that like, oh, we're having this, you know, we're showing The Bachelor, which like market research shows is watched by, you know, this age group. So you should buy advertising time so to reach that like broad demographic. But social media is more insidious than that, because it's like, I know exactly what age this person is. I know exactly what they like. I know what they don't like. And so you can buy an ad directly for this person. It's like, it's almost a, you know, surveillance style capitalism. But I think that you could easily have social media that isn't based on advertisement revenue, that would just be people talking to each other.
Start that way? Like,
yeah.
As a Facebook, there was no, like, you know, algorithm feed.
Right.
Advertisements.
Yeah.
You friended the people that you liked, and then you talked to them via the social media.
Yeah, like forums that existed in the past weren't based on advertising. They were just based on, we're trying to bring people together. Yeah, a lot of the social media sites were not originally advertisement based. They brought in advertising later. So I think, and like, you know, currently we have these like sort of federated social networks, like Blue Sky doesn't have advertisements yet, and like a Mastodon and things like that are trying to like create a social media platform that's not based on advertising revenue, that I think would be totally different. The experience would be different. You probably wouldn't be as hooked on it because that's not what it's trying to do. Yeah.
So I browse Mastodon sometimes because you don't need an account to. And I agree with you that it could be completely different. But my sense right now is that people on Mastodon still behave the way they have been conditioned to by mainstream social media. Like they say things in quips. They don't provide context. There's this constant urgency. Like scrolling down Mastodon right now feels the same. I don't have social media because it's like I can't even take that. It's so overstimulating. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that's right too. Because I have a Mastodon, and I would say the same thing. But I think that we've been conditioned to behave a certain way based on like we almost had no chance because television already conditioned our minds to behave, to think and act a certain way. So even when social media wasn't advertising based, it was still like we were still trying to be quippy. We were trying to the urge to be famous is there. Like we want to make something that other people find really quippy or funny, or like and social media certainly games that. They're like, oh, we're gonna promote posts that a lot of people have retweeted, a lot of people have liked, and things like that. But that drive is much older than social media. A lot of the things that we associate with social media actually, as problems inherent to social media, were actually academic terms came up with to describe television, which is really interesting. One of the big ones that people often talk about is the idea of a parasocial relationship, which is the idea that, oh, I don't know this person that I follow on Instagram, but it feels like I do. It feels like they're my friend. So when people are attacking them, it feels like they're attacking my friend. So I'm going to get in there and defend them. Or when they're selling a product, it feels like that's their recommend. It's like my friend is telling me about something. So it's a way of viewing people that you don't know as if they're your friends. But that was actually an academic paper written in I think the 1960s to describe women's love for Liberace on television. The idea the idea of a parasocial relationship is really old, and so that form of celebrity to I don't know, everyday person relationship, television encouraged that. I would go so far as to say that most Americans, whether you hate him or like him, have a parasocial relationship with Donald Trump because he's been on our television screens forever. We feel like he's a person we are aware of, and I feel like, for arguments of elimination of television mentions that people like Tucker Carlson or news personalities are in people's living rooms every single day, which the living room is usually like an area reserved for people you're quite familiar with. The only people who are going to be invited to your living room are usually your friends or people that you want to spend intimate time with. So to have Tucker Carlson in your living room every single day is it's sort of tricking your mind into thinking that person is like an intimate friend. That person cares about me. That for arguments for elimination of television kind of takes those arguments and what I would call kind of cranky directions. I don't know what the word is. He goes really, really far with that. It's saying it's literally psychological manipulation. But I do think that there's something to be said that if you're watching these people over and over again and you're watching them in an intimate setting, you are gonna be tricked into thinking that they care about you when really they're just trying to get you to watch to see the ads.
There's an interesting thing that.
Oh, here, let me.
I've had some amazing teachers about this, and certainly coming to Burlington even more, it's been exacerbated even more. But what it ultimately, when I'm hearing, is that you're talking about people's lives being looked at digitally while being an analog life, and something that is taking things out of context. And the more I've looked into this, I've found that there are stories that go back to Yoruba traditions, Lakota traditions, words in Tagalog, in Sanskrit, Hebrew, that address these things. So this is these are that television and social media is a symptom of something that has been something that we've wrestled with for thousands of years, and in the Quran, they talk about gibat, which is essentially stealing someone else's truth. Motzi shamra in Hebrew, ukukus in Quechua. And these are all ways of manipulating a society by taking a digital view of someone and putting it in and removing it from a context, like you were saying. And so I think that television is a great example of this, and social media. I like to just hear what you think about how this might, is this a symptom? I'm part of the houseless community, or the collective part of the Burlington community, and there's an impact on most of us are not in a place where we can watch a television or participate and have, there's occasionally like a Facebook or Instagram, but really, those accounts are used for communication and nothing more. So there is an advantage to that, but to see the impact of social media and television on the image of the unhoused is when there's no fighting back, when you're basically just able to manipulate their image and destroy and take us into whatever, to just other and speak of those and other instead of in community. That ultimately I'm seeing is by ostracizing, where anybody who ostracizes someone is ostracizing the concept of community, and that's what I see. This like the situation is doing, trying to look at, but it's an ancient conversation too.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing up that this is a much older, like, sort of concept. The image is being, like, the idea that the image can manipulate public opinion goes much older than television, which you brought up some of the ancient sort of religious texts that talked about it. Even the Jewish, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, the Christian New Testament also talk about that similar thing, that, like, you can use an image to get people riled up that they wouldn't otherwise be. And thank you also for bringing up the, sort of the tragic consequences for when people do that to, the most vulnerable people in our society. Unhoused people in Burlington have been the brunt of so much sort of vitriol and ire, because if you watch WCAX or some of our television news programs, they talk about that. They're trying to rile people up against it because, ultimately because it's good for advertising money, which is so silly. Like, that's, like, it convinces people to keep watching because people are motivated to watch if they're enraged, or if they ooh. And it also, like, another thing that one of these books mentioned, I can't remember which one, but this is also a really good point, because I think social media has the same thing, is sometimes it misplaces people's incentive. Like if you're watching, if you're scrolling social media, or not incentive, it misplaces people's sense of urgency or action. If you're watching something happen, sometimes you can think you did something, even though you didn't. So people can watch these sort of horrifying images and be like, oh, now I'm informed, and so then I can just go about my business. But it's like, but the person that you watched getting harmed, they're still harmed. Like, you actually need to go out and do something and get organized or do something in your community. But because you watched it, you feel like you did enough, which is not true. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. Abby?
Yeah, Gerrymander clearly has never watched Yellow Jackets. No, I guess this isn't, it's a question. I'm thinking about narrative TV, and I fully agree with, like, the consequences of having our news broadcasted visually, especially when we have, like, so many different channels to choose from that all are, promoting a different message. But in terms of, like, art, that's where I feel like the situation gets a little bit more complicated, because in order to make art, it's really difficult to do that if you don't have a distributor. And therefore, in this ecosystem, you need advertisers, which sucks. And I guess I'm just wondering, especially, like, now that we have streaming and we have to pay even more for these streaming platforms, like, as, like, a, instead of paying for advertisers. Like, is there another way? And I don't know what that answer is, or if there is an answer. But
that is a great question. And I think that narrative TV, none of these books, Four Arguments for the Elimination of Television does try to like include narrative TV. It's like, no, the whole thing's bad, but I think that argument is really poor. I don't think it's good. I'm like, and some more recent books that have kind of interacted with it have been like, I don't think that Gerrymander anticipated like Breaking Bad, or like these like, these really quite accomplished artistic, sort of statements on television. But I do think, is there an alternative to advertising revenue on television? Yes. We're being filmed by Town Meeting TV right now, which is a publicly funded television station, right? So there's no advertising. The same thing is true of the Media Factory in Burlington, and so community media, or PBS, public broadcasting, has always been sort of presented as perhaps an alternative to advertising. And they have had certainly artistically accomplished things, and those, like, I would call Sesame Street artistically accomplished, or Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, or like some of these things, that have been broadcast through PBS. So I think that's a big sort of question mark, is like, could we fund, sort of media art through public funds rather than doing it through advertising revenue. But then, subscription based models or things like that could work. There's a book, a really, really contemporary book called Stolen Focus by this guy named Johan Hari, who's talking mostly about social media. But his conclusion in the book is that, like, these sort of like attention-seeking platforms could be totally different if we got rid of the advertising model and replaced it entirely with a subscription-based model. So that's his solution. It's interesting though, because Netflix and these companies, they're trying to bring in ads, right? So like the incentive is never quite gone. Like, it's like, that's why, like, I feel like public broadcasting might be more the solution, because like then the profit incentive is removed. It's really, we're just trying to broadcast art to as wide an audience as possible. We're not trying to get money out of people. Oh yeah.
I just have one thing to add to that. I'm very pro artistic television, but TV shows that as an artistic platform. But streaming platforms are designed to get us to watch endlessly, even the good shit. And which, maybe in certain contexts is okay, but maybe goes back to the loneliness problem, where it's great to experience art, but you also have to talk to your friends and touch grass, etc.
Yeah, well, and I think that, like, art is so much better when experienced with other people, right? Like, it's like, yeah, if you're gonna watch The Bachelor, do it with friends, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to ask, what are your thoughts about the kind of transition from synchronicity, like things being broadcast at certain times, to the modern system where you can watch anything at any time? Do you think it's significant?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will say that one like transition that happened through the history of television that I didn't talk about that I think is similar is the transition from like exclusively broadcast TV on like 3 networks to cable television, where everybody can watch. Basically, we went from a market in which everyone was trying to appeal to everybody to a market in which you're only trying to appeal to a certain group of people because you're trying to like create a niche environment, which is different, right? Like look at ABC, NBC, and CBS were the only stations around. All of television was kind of meet in the middle, sort of like. I think that's partially why Gerrymander couldn't have anticipated Breaking Bad, because. And I'm using Breaking Bad as like a stand-in for, artsy TV, whatever you want to say, like, because ABC, NBC, and CBS would have never broadcast a show that kind of, artistically. Right. Well, then when it's saying really complex things about like greed and that, and like, so like, they're not gonna. That's a niche audience it's trying to reach, and that's who it reached. but I think that a similar thing has probably happened even more so with like the transition from cable TV to now streaming services, because now you don't have to get, like, if 3 million people are watching your show, that's a lot, whereas it used to be you want 40 million people watching your show, so that probably has allowed, I think it's obviously allowed for like different artistic visions to come through, like Netflix has greenlit shows that probably would have never been broadcast on network TV, because it's looking for a niche audience rather than a broad audience. But I think that, if you ever watch public access TV, there's stuff on there that would certainly never be greenlit on network TV either, and some of which can be quite artistically accomplished. I think, I think that PBS and public broadcasting generally, I think is really like the light in the darkness for me of like how could we do this differently. That's why I keep bringing it up, and that's why Town Meeting TV is here, because I do actually think that for all the hate I just said about TV, I think that they're performing a wonderful public service, and that's when we take the advertising revenue out of it, TV could be different.
I think another concept about TV that I believe the Society of the Spectacle mentions is the act of watching. So when you're watching TV, you're watching somebody else's life. Like if you're watching narrative TV, you're not watching your own life. You're not really participating. You're just kind of passively watching somebody else do things. And I feel like that really encourages this passivity or the lack of civic engagement, because, you're becoming invested in other characters' lives instead of your own.
Yeah, that is, and one thing the Society of the Spectacle says, one of my favorite lines that I think about all the time, is it says that he says that the Society of the Spectacle is a social relationship between people mediated by images. So the what he's saying is that often our social relationships are being mediated by television or by mass media, like instead of talking to our friends about like our own local problems or something, things like that, we're like, did you watch The Bachelor, or did you watch, so like our social relationships are being sublimated to these sort of large media enterprises. But yeah, I think that it's complicated in the sense that, like, I do think that if we're, even shows like Breaking Bad. I don't know why I keep using Breaking Bad. I should go with another artistic TV show, Mad Men. I don't know. I like Breaking Bad. That's why I keep saying I thought it was good. I think, should we still, like, even if we spent all of our time watching artistic television and still no time, getting civically engaged, that would still be a loss. Like, and Robert Putnam would still say, okay, there's still a problem here, right? Like, if Breaking Bad doesn't motivate us to get out and like make sure that our local chemistry teachers get public health care, then maybe there, it's not worth it in the end to do that. But yeah, a balance. Yeah. Any more questions or anything? Amazing, everybody. Well, come out to the Situationist talk on April 19th. Oh, you have one more question?
Sure.
Yeah.
I guess I just wanted to ask, like, what are your thoughts and opinions on, like, the long form podcasting now? Like, obviously, like, people kind of associate that with Joe Rogan, but there's a whole host of like conservative and liberal podcasters like going in that route and kind of like recreating like the Douglas Lincoln debates of like 18 whatever. But I just wanted to ask that, like, within the framework of your thoughts on, there's actually like a whole like subdiscipline of anthropology called like science and technology studies, which deals with like all of these concepts. But I like just find it extremely difficult, like in my own life, to part and parcel fact from fiction, and just like listening to like a whole host of people, like even like Elon Musk. I don't want this to become like a whole like political conversation, but I think he's kind of like the same thing as Donald Trump in like a very different facet in like the Twitter. Like he's just kind of this public figure that, like, what he's doing with his companies and his technologies is like, that's one component, but he's also just become this like face of like development, and just like trying to figure out like, okay, well, is he like what he's actually doing is like cutting like a whole bunch of essential services, or is he like shining light on the vampires and cutting like corruption? And I'm sure there is like a ton of corruption in Washington, but is what he's actually doing fighting that corruption, or just like cutting the things that we need to subsist on a daily basis? And I'm very educated. Like I'm doing a PhD, and I'm sure there's people with like GEDs that are like more informed than me in these certain components. But like I can't imagine like if you're just not educated at all, like how are you supposed to figure out like what is misinformation, what is not?
Yeah, I think that the quote from Neil Postman that I have in the handout actually says that like that's sort of like the end game of like sort of this like constant stream of disinformation and just so much information is that people are just going to lose the ability to tell fact from fiction. But to answer your podcast question, I think I'm just going to go back to the same, like, I feel like podcasts are probably great if they're not commercial. And if they are commercial, they're probably still have the same perverse incentives, right? Like Joe Rogan is there to like ultimately hawk protein pills. I actually don't know what he's selling you. Or like, you know, Alex Jones, like, which it is quite funny when like you listen to some of these podcasts that do this, because in a radio or podcasting venue, it's like, oh, you should be really mad about this thing, and I'm really mad, and have you heard about gold? You should invest in gold. Like, it's like, that's a weird transition, but like that's what they do. So like, I do think that like, or like, you know, you could like listen to like talk radio if it's the same thing, like Rush Limbaugh, who I'm not going to say R.I.P., but he's not with us anymore. He was the same thing, right? He would just kind of talk about like why you should be mad about, but then he would like, the ultimate goal is still just to sell you something. And I think that we should be very, very skeptical of that, just as a society. Like, what's the incentive? Are they trying to inform me, or are they just trying to sell me something? Because if that, you know, and so I think, but like, I imagine that there's probably like conservative podcasts who are non-commercial that are just trying to inform people. And I'm like, I respect that genuinely a lot more than like any sort of, you know, commercial enterprise that's just trying to keep you listening because they ultimately want you to listen to the ad read. And then there was one more question. It was something about
the nature of long-form podcasting, and then also just like finding misinformation. How do you weed through that? And besides like having, you know, Harvard Medical Journal like in front of you and just reading the entire thing, and yeah.
I think it's really hard. I mean, I'm sure I've fallen for you know, like I'm sure that all of us here have fallen for nonsense on the internet. But I think that like a really good razor, like a logical, I don't know, a tool that you can use is like, okay, is this medium trying to sell me something, or is it trying to give me information? Because I think that like that will tell you there's a really, really good essay that I could find and maybe like link to after the talk. But there's a really good essay that talks about how like the good information is behind paywalls, and the bad information is free because the free information is being paid for by advertisers. Like I think that is a huge problem with like the disinformation sort of ecosystem. Whereas in like you can get, you know, like conspiracy theory websites for free because they're just advertisements all over the place. But then if you want to read the New York Times, you got to have a subscription, which is like, you know, so that's one way in which the subscription model is failing us, because it's like the people who can't pay for a subscription are just going to get their information from places that aren't really trying to inform them. They're just trying to get them to buy something. But luckily, like, you know, just like PBS, there are sources of information that are not commercial, that really are just, you know, publicly funded in order to inform you. And according to the study by Farley Dickinson University, the best source of information is NPR, which is of course a non-profit, just trying to give you information source of news, and it can be hyper localized too, right? Like you could listen to Vermont Public, and then you get like very specific information about Vermont. You could listen to, and I think there's NPR stations, affiliates all throughout the country. And I think that the demonization of NPR when it happens by these commercial stations is quite telling. Like, it's like, I don't want you to get your information from somewhere that is not trying to sell you something, because I want to sell you something.
What are their arguments? They're just like, this is not a reliable source.
Yeah, they'll just say, oh, you know, it's not a reliable source, which is hilarious, because you know, you're not even incentivized to give me a reliable source of information, whereas that's more or less the incentive of public media. Yeah. Anything else? I think that's it. Come to the Situationist Talk on April 19th, and we'll talk more about what we can do. And before you go, I just want everybody to know that if you want to support the Peace and Justice Center and the stuff that we do here, like you really enjoyed listening to this free lecture and sort of this discussion we had, you can sign up to be a Peace and Justice Center member. You can do that on our website at pjcvt.org/membership. It's as little as $4 a month, and you can make sure that we keep all these things free for the public. We do all kinds of stuff here. We do this sort of rad history lecture once a month. We do prison letter writing. We've written more than 100 plus letters to people at the local women's prison. We do folk song singing, where I teach people like sort of the history of folk music, and we write a folk song together. We do zines and button making. We do like peace building education work. So I would love your support. And if you do sign up, you get like a nice little Peace and Justice Center membership card that gets you some perks. You get 5% off at places like Specs Cafe in Winooski. You get 5% off at the Bookery in Rochester, Vermont. That's a new one. So yeah, thank you so much for coming, everybody.